Hello everyone, today is going to be a quick look at this Nokia WiFi Beacon 2, input 12 volts, 1.5 amps, and on the underside it also has an on-off switch. The power supply that comes with it in the UK is this one, which is 12 volts and also 1.5 amps, as you'd expect, and with an unusual sheathed output there. So when you plug it in, I guess nothing can drop down the back and make contact. I'm not really sure why that might have a covering on it. Anyway, I will plug that into the power, and then let's have a look at this device itself. So the device has a single LED on the front, obviously the Nokia logo, and on the underside we've got the label and a lot of ventilation. So when it's sat down, it's kind of levitated off of the ground with a lot of ventilation there, and on the top there's also a huge amount of ventilation in there. If you take one of these to bits, most of the weight and most of the size, in fact, is a massive heatsink on the weirdly on the opposite side of the board to all of its chips. And then there's two aerials for the 5 GHz, which are little weird metal cans, or like canister type affairs, and then two circuit boards, which are the 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi antennas as well. Let's plug it in. Oh, sorry, also on the back we have a power connector, as you'd expect, a WAN connector, LAN connector, a reset button, and the WPS button to connect devices like printers or computers without needing to type in the password. So I'll power that on, and the next thing we'll do is probably go over to a computer and see what the web interface looks like. So weirdly, these are sold as Wi-Fi extenders, but they are also basically routers. So most people or most providers are probably selling these as extenders, but if you needed to and you want an Ethernet router, then you can use this for that function as well. Although weirdly, in Wi-Fi repeating or access point kind of bridge mode, you will get lower performance out of this than if it is in routing mode. So I was expecting that to do something slightly different with its power LED. It hasn't done anything to indicate that it's booted up, so it's either still booting or it's failed to boot. Let's see what I can see on my list of available Wi-Fi networks, and then go from there. I do not yet see it available as a network to connect to, so something's not quite right with... Ah, there we go. It's now available. Just took a very long time to start up, and during all of that the LED didn't change colour, which is a bit, I'd say, quite unusual for a device. It doesn't flash to show you that it's booting or something. At the moment, now it's gone red. There we go. So I don't have it connected to a network at the moment, so it's probably gone red to signify that there is no internet connectivity. If I try and extract a network cable to plug it in with, so I'm going to plug this into the blue WAN port. And the light has now gone blue. So if you're booting up, it's white. If you are not connected to the internet, it is red. If you're connected to the internet, it's blue, although I'm not sure why it temporarily went red again there. What we'll do is swap over to a computer. Okay, I've moved over to a computer and I've got a screen recording going so you can see what's going on the screen. I've gone to the default IP address of the router, which is 192.168.18.1, and the default username is admin, and the password is on the label on the underside of the router. In my instance, it was also the same as the Wi-Fi password. So I'm going to log in, and we get a topology which would show other devices if you had wireless mesh devices, and then you've got devices, which is the list of connected things. So if, there's only one thing connected at the moment, which is my laptop through a network cable, but you would see, say, wireless devices for any other things that you had connected at the same time, or other stuff connected into the network port on the back. So I'm going to click on Network Details and see what that shows. And interestingly, it shows serial number, onboarding status as root, which I'm not really sure what that means. Probably, I see root must be to do with whether it's the main point on the network or whether it's a satellite or similar. Backhaul status is good because it's the only device that's part of that mesh network, and MAC address and IP address. None of the buttons here seem to do anything until I click on close, and nothing else can be clicked other than a refresh button. Interestingly, at the bottom it shows what browsers are supported, which I guess is nice to know rather than guessing. Moving on, we can select the language: English, Chinese, something else, maybe Japanese, Portuguese or Turkish, and we can log out. Going to the status link, it's got device information such as the firmware version, which is quite a crazy versioning number, boot ROM version, the chipset that it runs, and the uptime of the device. LAN status will show you that, interesting that wireless is lumped in there as well, but it shows you details about the wireless and what channel it is on, and information about the LAN settings on the device as well. Nice that it also shows whether the Ethernet port is up, so if you're trying to remotely support one of these and you want to know if somebody's plugged something into it, you can go to this screen and see whether it's plugged in and also what rate it's running at. WAN status shows what you'd expect it to show, whether it's connected, and does it show what speed it's linked at. Interesting for a network port, it doesn't show you the speed, whereas the LAN side does show you the speed that it's linked at. So if you had a faulty cable going between this router, the Nokia router, and the ONT, then, so like your fiber modem, then you wouldn't know necessarily that it was running at 100 megabits per second. IPv6 status doesn't look like it's configured by default on this one. And shows you details about the LAN side and what's connected. And I don't believe that least time remaining. In fact, that is actually correct, that it knows that it didn't provide me that IP address, because I have just remembered I do have a static IP address set on this laptop network interface. So it's quite correct there when it knows that the device is there, but it's a statically configured device and it doesn't have a DHCP lease. Statistics for the LAN shows you pretty much what it shows in the LAN status screen earlier, and I suspect the WAN also shows similar. Yep, just packets and number of frames dropped. And WLAN, which is interesting because it appears to be ignoring broadcast packets, because I'm sure there's broadcast going on the network, unless maybe it doesn't transfer those over the radio layer if there's nobody connected to it, which is possible. Going on to the settings screen, we have network, where it would be nice to change the IP address of the router, but it looks like you don't have the ability to do so. In fact, it doesn't look like we've got the ability to change any of those settings. Which is rather strange. That may be to do with the ISP that provided this device, they've possibly locked it down so that you can't change any settings, but it does seem very strange that you can't even change the IP address and whether it's got DHCP server enabled or not. Under IPv6 LAN settings, we also cannot change any of these settings. And it's also true of WAN. But having said that, the ISP that I've got this from uses PPPoE. So it seems really unusual that I'm unable to change any of these settings, and the default is not PPPoE. So if you plug this into the ISP's network that it came from, then you wouldn't be able to use the internet because these settings in this WAN settings screen are wrong. However, it still may be useful to know what the screen looks like even though I'm unable to edit it. Will I be able to change the wireless details? So those I can change. We've got the mode that it runs in and whether 2.4 GHz is enabled or not, the bandwidth or channel width, which I'm going to set to 40 MHz. Channel generally is a good idea to set to auto unless it decides to change the channel in the middle of you using it. You can set the transmit power. I think that's wireless multimedia. Don't know what the implications of enabling or disabling that are. Multi-user MIMO you probably do want enabled, and quite astonishingly it can have up to 128 devices connected to the 2.4 GHz radio. You can have multiple Wi-Fi names and you can change that name there. You can enable it being broadcast, or sorry, enable it or disable it and enable it being broadcast or not. Set the encryption mode. Impressively, it seems to support WPA3 as well. Set the wireless key. Enable the WPS, which is the button on the back of the router, which would allow people to press the button without knowing what the password for the Wi-Fi is. And WPS mode, normally you want it on push button config, but I guess it can also be station pin and access point pin, but I've never seen the pins method used much at all. It's probably not even worth going through that. Going over to 5 GHz is going to be pretty much the same settings, except for the channel widths will be higher, so you can go up to 80 MHz on 5 GHz channel, and otherwise the settings are basically going to be very much the same. QoS config is going to be way too complicated to do in this, and also if you're using one of these routers, you've probably got a connection which is fast enough to not need to worry about doing QoS and packet prioritizing. There's also a high chance that once the packet leaves your router and goes off to the ISP, that the ISP drops or overwrites that quality of setting, quality of service setting anyway. In mesh, we can enable bridge mode, which is what most people will probably use this box for, which means that it just becomes an access point on the network. It doesn't try to be a DHCP server and doesn't try and control the network. Sadly, I don't have another one of these Nokias to use it in its mesh mode to see what all of these other buttons would do. Under maintenance, we can change the admin password, so let's give that a go. Okay, it won't let you set a very weak password, which I guess is probably a good thing. Under device management, you can give devices friendly names. So I guess if we go back to overview, I'd hope that it shows the friendly name there. So that was under maintenance, device management. You can remotely reboot the device without having to go and unplug it or switch it off and on. You can enable factory defaults, which will factory reset the device. There's also going to be another video, which will be linked in the description, which is how to factory reset this router using a paperclip or a pin in the reset hole on the back of the router. So use that in the description if you need a video to do that. Under Diagnostics, we should be able to ping devices or traceroute them. And the results should show there. And there we are. Under log, it should give some vague details. Looks like it's attempting to make a connection out to Nokia by default, which is a little bit creepy. So that was before it was connected, maybe. Still failing to connect, which for me is good. I'd rather it didn't reach out to Nokia without it making it very clear that that's what it was doing. Changing that to debug doesn't appear to do anything, although it hasn't been logging at debug level anyway. Although I think I get it. I need to do that. Click on save. Just see how verbose it is with its information. It's actually pretty good. A lot of this is TR069 or ACS nodes to do with configuration. That's pretty good verbose log there. I mean, I'd rather a router told you more information than you needed than not enough, so that's good. Under troubleshooting, which is a bit strange that we've got a diagnostics but also a troubleshooting screen as well. Just gives you the status of the WAN. Oh, this will be fun. A downstream speed test. Let's see how accurate that might be. Oh, it's taking quite some time. 3.92 kilobits a second. That's definitely wrong. My connection is more like 1 gigabit per second. So I'm not sure how it's managed to figure out only 3.92. Also with a huge amount of packet loss in some unknown value. Try the speed test again. So we're at 3069 downstream packet loss and 3.92 kilobits a second. Even slower with more packet loss. I don't really understand. Presumably that's testing to either a congested server or just generally the router's got an awful speed test function. Let's do the latency test and see what that comes back with. Although I assume maybe this box isn't something that you were meant to type in. Maybe it is. Oh yeah, it must be. So fine. I mean, that makes sense there. And DNS response time. Wow, that's taking a very long time for OpenDNS, which makes me think that this... Oh, it did, okay, it took 17 milliseconds, but it took many, many, many seconds longer to actually return that 17 milliseconds. Impressively, it has port mirroring, which I'm not sure why you would want that on a router with only 2 ports. because if you're mirroring a port, you may as well just plug straight into the cable that is plugged into the router, because there's only two things that could plug into that router. So what would you gain out of mirroring the port versus just plugging it directly into a computer? Very strange. Not really sure why that function would exist, other than this was designed for a router with more ports, and obviously this router only has two, and they've left that feature in there maybe. Under application, we've got port forwarding, so let's try and add in my SMTP server. Let's have a go. Yep, SMTP server. That should fill in port 25 automatically. Go through to this laptop is fine using that WAN connection. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, perfect. It's done port 25 through to my laptop. Let's also do port 963 into LAN port 963. Once again to my laptop, and it will be TCP and UDP. Seems straightforward enough, so that's all right. Port triggering, I have never really figured out what practical use that is, so I'm not going to bother going into that. Dynamic DNS, it supports dynDNS.org, which is not free. NodeIP.com, which is free, but you do need to click on a link every month, I think, in an email. You've got GNU DIP, which I think is an open source type one, so you can run your own server, or there's lots of free servers. I've never heard of dsec.io, and I've also never heard of dtdns.com. But those are the ones that are supported. NTP, Network Time Protocol, defaults to going to probably quite a big NTP server. Never heard of this backup secondary NTP server though, very strange. And I don't have the ability to change any of those settings, even if I wanted to anyway. Under UPNP, interestingly, it's off by default, but I shall switch that on. UPNP is used by torrent clients and game consoles and some other things to automatically add in port forwards without you having to do it manually. So if you're security conscious, you might not want to enable that, but for ease of use and NAT issues on consoles, you would want UPnP generally to be enabled. Security, we've got firewall, which is off by default. Attack protection is enabled, whatever that means. I really wish some of these would tell you more details about what they mean by attack protection. MAC filtering is a very bad way of limiting who's allowed to use your internet. It's easy to spoof or change your MAC address on most devices, so do not rely upon MAC filtering to block people from using your internet. IP filtering is also not really worth using unless for some reason you had, say, a device within your network that was reaching out to a known IP address and you didn't want it to communicate with that, in which case you might want to use this. DMZ and ALGs. ALG is application layer gateway, which are little helpers that run on the router that try to make communication more reliable. So if you've got a bad SIP or a VoIP client, ticking the SIP ALG might improve things. More often than not, though, generally the SIP ALG and possibly these other ALGs cause more problems than they solve. So be aware if you're having VoIP problems or FTP problems, you might want to turn off some of these ALGs. DMZ is the equivalent of port forwarding every single port on the router through to a device. You should really only use it if you know why you're doing that. So you've got a server or something that you know that you want absolutely every port to go through to it. Anyone who says that for a game console or for a bit of software you need to enable DMZ, that is a really bad solution to a problem. The correct answer really should be, what ports do you need to port forward, rather than just using in DMZ and sending all the traffic through to that device. So generally, you should only enable this if you know why you need to enable it. And that's the end of the
admin interface, and that's basically it. I'm a bit baffled why I'm unable to change some of these settings. I will see if I can find any information about that. If I do, it will be in the video description or possibly a pinned comment on the video. Hopefully this video has been helpful to you. If it has, it would be really helpful to me if you wouldn't mind subscribing to my YouTube channel. You don't need to have the video notifications switched on, but the subscriber numbers really do help. Thanks very much.